Hi, this is Sam Adams from MUS 640, and this is my presentation for musical preference and personality from the survey we did a while ago. My overview for this research, I designed a study to see how people self-identified with their personalities, and also to try to link those personality types to certain musical genres. The personality types I actually used a word from a description of each personality type that were listed in the Myers-Briggs personality types. And then the participants were asked to identify the word out of a list that most closely matched their personality. And I also, for that particular question, I asked them to choose one. I actually asked a follow-up question as well where they could choose any secondary traits that they thought pertained to them as well. Participants were then asked to identify what musical genre they enjoyed to listen to the most. And I also asked them some other questions about their background, such as if they were a musician, or what age group they were in, things like that, to try to figure out some other things and to try to disguise the questions a little bit so they wouldn't match up personality questions with genre questions. I didn't want them to understand what the survey was about, so they wouldn't try to change one answer or the other to match what they thought their personality should be, or what their genre should be. So, for the results, I only talked about the 6 personality types that received at least 10% of the responses, because there were several personality types that received like 1% or 0.5%. So I only did the 6 largest groups, which is at least 60% of the people surveyed. And these subgroups are listed by the trait as they selected them on the survey. So these first 3 charts here, you can see some of the questions I asked. First, what is your age group? Are you a musician? What's your favorite genre of music to listen to? And you can kind of see there how the breakdown of each of these major sections went. And these are in alphabetical order, like on the favorite musical genre. These are alphabetical order on the screen on the chart here, not listed as order of preference. For all the participants, including the small subgroups, I didn't go over the results specifically in this study. Pop was the most popular musical genre, and 20%, a little over 20% of the entire group picked pop. Rock was second most popular at 13.1. R&B and soul was the least selected genre with about 1%, and it was actually tied with a few others, but there was an option in the survey for them to write in. The participants could write in their own genre, so that's why so many on the bottom chart on the right have very, very small slivers, because they wrote in, maybe one person wrote in a certain more obscure genre. So several of them picked the same kind of genres, but they wrote them in so that the Google charts did not classify them as the same thing. So anything less, that's why I chose anything less than the 6 largest groups. They have 10%. The largest age group that responded was 26 to 35-year-olds, which is my same age group. So this probably had a little bit to do with the fact that most of the people who responded were people I knew on social media or friends I emailed it to, who are all about my same age. So that could skew, I'll talk about this toward the end a little bit, but it could skew the results somewhat based on just that sample size. But you can see there were several other age groups represented as well. And 67% of the participants self-identified as musicians. And I asked them in a follow-up question what instrument they played. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Alright, so the first subgroup I set aside was the practical subgroup, and this is linked to the introverted sensing, thinking, perceiving personality type, or ISTP. Almost 35% of the practical subgroup selected rock as their favorite genre, which is the most popular in this subgroup, and second most popular overall, again, for all of the subgroups. 30.7% of the members of the practical subgroup did not identify as musicians, which is the second lowest percentage for all the groups. 82% also identify with similar secondary traits, so traits that were similar to practical, such as logical, analytical, or systematic. And this suggests that the people who identified as this subgroup perceive their personality as more analytical overall than emotion-based. Second subgroup was logical, which is similar to practical. Rock and pop tied for the favorite genres of this group, each by 22%. And this group had the highest percentage of musicians, with 27% identifying as non-musicians. The majority, or 41% of the musicians, were woodwind players, and that could suggest a possibility of connection between playing a woodwind instrument and more logical personalities, since such a high percentage of the people who identified as musicians were in fact woodwind players. 70% of the people in this group chose similar secondary personality traits, such as practical, analytical, and methodical, which is kind of similar to the first subgroup, the way they chose more very similar secondary traits for themselves. The third subgroup is compassionate, the compassionate subgroup. POP was the highest, again in this group, with 22.7% of the participants. Highest number of different musical genres was chosen within this group, with 13 different genres chosen, with at least 1% of the vote. When asked about any secondary traits, 100%, this is unusual, it's the only time this happened, 100% of the people in this group chose traits similar to compassionate, or as people-centered, or nurturers, empathetic, and that would indicate a higher focus on emotional or well-being traits within this group. And this is compared to only 64%, which is still a high percentage, but much lower than 100 of the members of this subgroup who selected other traits more similar to logical or practical. Personality subgroup number 4 was empathetic. Highest number of different instruments reported played by the participants was in this group at 12. The genre of pop was again the highest percentage with 27%. Second favorite genre was alternative with 18%. 53% of the participants in this subgroup who identified as musicians played some kind of wind instrument, so not percussion, or some other like electronic instrument, but they played some kind of wind instrument. 37.5% woodwinds, 62.5% with brass. This is the only one of the top 6 subgroups where there are no musicians identifying as vocalists, so all of them were instrumentalists of some kind. And 91% of the people in this group selected some emotional or well-being related traits, similar to empathetic, as their secondary traits. Personality subgroup number 5 is people-centered, and nobody in this subgroup named pop as their favorite genre, which is the only time this happened in the top 6 that I studied. Again, pop was the favorite overall for the entire group, but no one in this group apparently picked it. The favorite genres were split between many of them, and there was not a clear majority. Several of them got a higher percentage than the rest, but there were still 5 or 6 that were pretty much tied for the top percentage. And the highest percentage of vocalists was in this group, at 38.4% of the people who identified as musicians. This is the only of the top 6 subgroups to have no percussionists. So we had no vocalists in the last one, no percussionists in this one. 86% of the participants in this subgroup identified as secondary traits to be something similar to people-centered. Pop in the subgroup number 6, imaginative, is the top genre by 25%, or it has 25% of the participants. This is the second subgroup to include no vocalist, which is again a little unusual. This is the only group we had electronic music or MIDI selected as a performance instrument. Only one person selected it. And we have very mixed musical preferences. This group was different and kind of unique in the fact that it was almost evenly split between structured music like rock and pop and less structured music like jazz and folk. The personality traits were also very mixed. It was almost evenly split between logic-centered traits and more emotional or people-centered traits. Several people, when they were asked for secondary traits, picked a mix of both kinds, which didn't happen too often on the other subgroups, but on this one it happened quite often. Some things to note, as I mentioned at the beginning, the sample size for this was fairly small. It was 198 people responded to this survey. Many of them were friends with each other, or at least acquaintances with each other, or with me, and so they likely share a lot of common interests. And again, they shared a lot of common age groups and things like that. Several participants selected all or almost all the available traits when they were asked to select secondary traits, which possibly, I tried to figure out why that would be. Possibly they were trying to rank them in order of what they thought was most important, and so they selected all of them in a certain order instead of just selecting the ones they thought would apply to them. Or they might have figured out that I was trying to match personality traits with genres, and they tried to adjust their secondary traits to make it line up with a certain genre. I don't know which one it would be, but either way it could skew the results a little bit. It could also skew the results somewhat, although I wouldn't think very much, that I did not talk about the small subgroups that only receive 1% or less of the overall responses. So there could be some conclusions drawn if you group them all together in these very small subgroups, but most of what I learned from this I think I'll be able to learn from groups of more than 1 or 2 people. So conclusions. Participants in general seem pretty consistent in how they identified their personalities. There does not seem to be a huge correlation between one specific genre, like rock or pop, for example, and one specific personality type, but there does seem to be some correlation between musical taste and personality. It doesn't seem like it would be strong enough to overrule other environmental factors like what they hear most on the radio or what their friends listen to and expose them to, things like that, but their own tastes seem to be a little bit correlated to their personality. For example, people who are in the subgroups who identify more as logical or something related to that tend to prefer more music that is structured, like rock or pop, and people who identified as more emotional or people-based personalities tend to prefer less predictable things like jazz or folk or alternative, things that have a little bit less predictability built into them. Here's the Myers-Briggs website that I use for the personality types. And these are the graphs that I did not use earlier on in the presentation to give you an idea of what the percentages were for all these different things. And these are for overall, not for individual subgroups, because I had to do those separately.